I would like to open up with the perfect storm that Dan is talking about. We're here to talk about financial resources, and I've always said as a 28-year veteran as a superintendent, quite frankly, money is the engine that drives the train. And you can't ignore money because without it, nothing much else will happen. Goodwill will carry us only so far. At the federal level, as you can see, the stimulus money is coming to an end. Reduced education funding seems to be on the horizon. Dan has verified that. And there's going to be a real cost to implementing the race to the top monies.
So, and I'd like to take a moment to really focus on New York State, because that's where everybody is here, and of course where most people who are training are probably going to end up teaching. So in New York State, there's so many things going on, it's hard to know where to start. But we'll start with the property tax cap, which has been something that hallmark that the new governor came in with. The Senate has already approved. A lot of people hear that as a 2% cap, but it's actually not. It's actually the CPI or 2%, whichever is lower. To give you an example, last year the CPI was under 0%. For this year it's 1.6%. So you're talking about very significantly low numbers, and that would be on a tax levy, so that's the amount of taxes that actually go out to the property owners. And on top of that, we're looking at a lot of things that are going down. So for example, if we look at this year's budget, New York State has cut the amount of state aid that it's giving to school districts by over 7.3% statewide, but in Westchester and Putnam, in our area, it's over 13% cut in state aid. That's very significant. And on top of that, districts in our area are looking at the increased cost for pension. As I think everyone's aware, the pension costs would come mostly from the school districts, and so it's based on a very sophisticated formula that we won't get into. But there's a number that each year the school districts are told this is what you're going to pay. In fact, you don't pay it, it's taken out from the state aid before you get it. So it's not optional. But that amount for this year's budget that's being planned for the 2011-12 budget is going to go up an amount that would be equivalent on most budgets to about a 2% budget-to-budget increase. That's really significant. So we're talking about less state aid, increases right there for pension, and that's before you've really even looked at your program or you've looked at anything having to do with contractual obligations that you have. The other thing I think that's important to realize is, particularly in our area, we don't get a lot of state aid. So for districts that don't, sometimes it's the good news and the bad news. When the aid is really cut, the cuts to us are smaller, but that's why you see areas like Westchester being touted as having the highest property taxes, because all of the burden is really on the local property tax owner. Very little comes in from the state. And I think the other piece, which was mentioned before, has to do with the stimulus money, which is drying up. So that was a source of money which we will not be seeing in the coming budgets that are coming forward. And you're really going to, you'll start to see, read through the papers, you're going to see districts really struggling with what they're going to do with those budgets. So we have the taxpayer fatigue. We have no relief coming through at all from mandated costs. I think people might be aware there was a commission that Governor Cuomo put in when he started. Everyone was very excited. Finally, somebody's going to address some of the mandate relief issues that are up on the table. And the initial report came out yesterday, and personally, it was really disappointing because it basically said, talked a little about WIC's law, which has to do with school construction, which is a burden on schools, talked about PLAs and project labor agreements, but it really didn't talk about the other key mandates, and basically said, there are some really tough mandates out there, we need to study these. Well, we've been studying them for a really long time, as a lot of other people. So it was very disappointing to see that basically it said, yes, there are mandates, we can't have costs put onto these mandates when anything gets passed, but we really need to sit down and study it. So the bottom line is we're not going to see any changes to that. And the other thing, of course, is that you're seeing districts that are really having to make some challenging choices, and we'll get to that in a little bit. And collective bargaining, of course, the constraints with that, the Triborough Amendment to the Taylor Law, which people might or might not be familiar with, it basically was put into place many, many years ago, and it basically says that in order to not have strikes, that if a contract expires, the existing terms of the contract continue. So in times that are challenging economically, like these times, it really doesn't give that much incentive for both sides to come to the bargaining table and want to come to agreement. And therefore, again, you see a lot of expired contracts in our area, and another pressure that goes on onto the local taxpayer. So that's kind of a little glimpse into the storm. It's quite a tempest.
On that note, then, what options do we have as school districts? And we really have to address two key questions. We must maintain educational quality for the sake of the students, first of all, but we also have to limit the property tax burden because there is real taxpayer fatigue out there. Now, traditionally, and Dr. Dominique did refer to this, school districts went to budget cutting, temporarily effective, but they really avoided structural reforms.
And what's interesting about these changes, and these are the kind of things that have been happening, and I also want to mention, it was mentioned before about 2008, the big changes in the economy. If you look at school districts in our region, starting in the last 2 years in particular, there have been a lot of cuts that have been made, a lot of things to address, to be really more sensitive to the local property taxpayer and to the realities of what's going on. So talking about superintendents before, actually very high percentage of superintendents in our region voluntarily froze their salaries. They did it for 1 year, a lot of them did it for 2 years. This is something that they just did because they felt that they needed to lead by example, although the example didn't necessarily follow. And the other thing is, if you look at a lot of these things that are here, these are the kind of things you can reduce some of these things, but you can't keep reducing them year after year, because eventually you come down to where there's nothing left to cut other than something that's really, really going to have tragic results for the children in the classroom.
You can only lower the thermostat so low, and then you can't use that one anymore. So, in current school finance research, unfortunately, there isn't too much going on to help us in this area. They have been looking, some of the theorists have been looking at the overall state of finance, and that's important to look at from the theoretical perspective. And they've been looking at the relationship between school funding and achievement, and that's important too. But what we haven't been looking at is what approaches will produce cost savings and manage school systems more effectively and efficiently. Now, interestingly, and this is our first recommendation, Alan Oden, who's a nationally known figure in school finance, did take a shot at this back in 1998 with his book, which was largely ignored for the simple reason that we didn't have a crisis. There's another book out now, Hess and Osberg, and I'm sure Frederick Hess is known by Dan. He's coming from the perspective, together with Osberg, about stretching the school dollar. We want to talk a little bit about that, because in the final analysis, school board leaders and district leaders are going to have to address efficiencies in order to reserve those dollars for students.
What's kind of interesting is if you look at this slide, we really start with the agrarian age of schools, go into the industrial age, and now we're in the knowledge-based age. But if you think about a lot of the schools, and I think high schools are a perfect example, they really haven't changed a whole lot. They certainly haven't changed from what most of us remember in the classroom, and you can go way back before that and they haven't changed. And there was a reference before to the school calendar of Virginia. Well, in New York State, it's really about the same thing. You can't start school before September 1st, and you can't mandate anybody to stay after June 30th because we're all working in the fields under that agrarian model. So things really don't change, even though if you think about it, something like that makes absolutely no sense in this day and age.
So if we're going to shift our values and beliefs beyond an agrarian, hopefully, and even an industrial age into a knowledge-based economy, let's look at some of the structural reforms that have to be placed on the table for discussion and conversation. In an industrial age economy, which we're currently in, individual districts, municipalities independently deliver services, and quite frankly, some of those services are redundant.
And under the knowledge-based economy, we'll start to show you several examples of things that are done more collaboratively with consolidations and looking at a regional approach and some economies of scale.
In an industrial age economy, every school district has to individually bargain with its teachers.
And under a knowledge-based economy, we'd be looking at some models of regional collective bargaining. A lot of the models out there have started with things like benefits initially or wages, some of the larger items that are more common. In New York State, there might be some legal things that would have to be looked through regarding the Taylor law. But there are certainly things that could be done so that it could be done on a more regional basis and that there could be more information shared as it is now with the individual districts. If you look at those contracts, they vary very, very much.
Currently, there is what we call a defined pension benefit plan. Many of us in this room enjoy that. And quite frankly, it is a very good benefit plan because you're sure of a certain amount of money each year in retirement. But recently, just this week to be exact, the Governor's Commission has talked about a Tier 6, which would be a defined contribution plan. And some younger people would prefer that as well, where instead of getting specific benefits over a period of time upon retirement, they would be able to save their money like a 401k or 403b, and that would also cap what the state would be putting in. So it would be a known quantity of money that would be invested.
And I would also add that within that, there are some models currently in New York State. For example, if you are a professor in a CUNY or SUNY system, you actually have an option of which plan you would do. You can either go with defined benefit or defined contribution, probably based on the theory kind of to what you just said, that professors tend to move. They might move from state to state, and so you really wouldn't want somebody to be locked into a particular system that's locked within a certain state. And I think to add to what was just talked about with some of the younger employees who might go into education but not be feeling that they want to stay in for their career. Also on the other side of it, there's a real push right now to have some people come into education as a second career, particularly in the areas of STEM where we're really looking for some people who've had some field experience, might have worked in this area for IBM or for some other technology companies or whatever. And for somebody like that, if they're coming into education and they're starting in the system and they're already in their 50s, or possibly even older than that, the defined system that we have now, the defined benefit system, really is not going to be the best system for them because they would have to be really old to be able to max out at it. So from both ends, there's a lot of possibilities for some change there. And there are other models as well. For example, in New Jersey, they have a hybrid model where it's a defined benefit up to a certain level. I think it's about $100,000, and then for any income over that, it becomes a defined contribution, so that you get a little bit of both. So there are a lot of options out there, but New York State has not really opted for any of them. When we did the Tier 5 last year, it was basically just tweaking what is the same essential model, and we really need a different kind of model.
In an industrial age economy, each district is autonomous irrespective of its size. Now, I don't know if there's anyone here from Cantico Hills, 200 students, Tuckahoe, Elmsford, 500, 700, 800 students. We have a number of small districts in Westchester County. If you go to Westchester County 2000, they laid out a plan where many of those districts would be consolidated to sizes of 5,000 pupils or more. And obviously it never got off the table in terms of discussion. But
that's another example of something kind of like when you talked about the book before, where the time sometimes just isn't right for the conversation. So if we're looking at consolidation, there's obviously a lot of conversation about that on the national level, on the state level, to consolidate school districts, or to be looking at consolidating services, and to really have some functional consolidation. And Ron's going to talk about that more in a little bit. Interestingly enough, if you look at some of the research, there's some real keys to look at when you're doing consolidations and what kind of districts might be more compatible. Things having to do with their finances certainly play in, with the size, with what the contracts are like. And the other thing that comes in, which is always very important in school districts, is that the two districts should not be rivals in athletics. They usually don't merge really well, so I think that's something to keep in mind for the future.
And I know Jerry and Michael will be talking about this in length, so we just want to just set the table for them as well. In an industrial age economy, right now, we have fixed staffing models that are very clear and very identifiable, but in a knowledge-based economy.
Some of the things to look at are more of a differentiated staffing. Really taking a look at what is the role of the teacher, of teaching assistants or other support positions. Are there different ways to deliver the instruction and to really create professional learning communities within our school districts?
Currently, we have very predictive personnel systems. If you know your salary, there are automatic increases. steps, longevity, and quite frankly, a lot of people like that. They think it ought to remain that way. But in a knowledge-based economy,
There's a lot of conversations about having merit pay, and there's a lot of research either way on that. So I think that's one of those dialogues that's going to take a while before we really get somewhere with it. But it's really looking at, are there other models? Should everybody be compensated the same way? Should it depend on what you're teaching, where you're teaching, and some of the other things besides the number of years that you've been there or the number of credits that you have?
and while we believe administrators should always play a role in observations and evaluations, why should we not involve many supervisors, have peer observations, lesson videotape, using student achievement results, and, in fact, student feedback, which is quite common at the higher ed level? Can we move in the industrial age from generic professional development to,
As was mentioned before, really, to something that's much more individualized. And so I know we're going to talk a lot more later about the APPR, but some of those pieces really fit into really looking at what does each individual really need in terms of professional development, and can it be delivered? So instead of having a staff development day that's on the third Wednesday in March, where everybody's going to sit in the auditorium and do something, and then maybe you're going to break up by grade level or by subject, to really take a look at, are there certain things that we should be working with each individual, and really targeting it around those particular items. And it's really, and the other thing I would add is, it's really looking at a lot of these things as more of a 360. In terms of the peer review, it really goes two ways. It goes with teachers being able to go in someone else's classroom and observe and see what they're going, and somebody else going into your classroom and giving some input, as opposed to just coming from other administrator, as it is now, where it's much more of a formal and structured kind of evaluation.
and as Lisa said, that 360-degree evaluation will get you from qualified only, which is currently the requirement to become an educator in New York State certification standards, to qualified and
Effective. And that's, I think that's one of the, as was mentioned before, there are some really good parts to anything that comes forward. The whole idea of really looking at an effectiveness in the classroom, if you think about people that you know, there are a lot of people who are highly qualified for something. They're not necessarily so effective at what they do, or maybe they were effective, but things have changed. Either the world has passed them by, or they have some things going on in their lives, or whatever it might be, where their effectiveness is just not the same. The way that the current structure works, that's pretty difficult to deal with. The 3028 hearings were mentioned before as something that needs some attention in New York State. But right now, if you're qualified, you're basically qualified. And so this really looks at effectiveness, and I know it'll be discussed a lot more later, so we'll pass over that one for now.
so structural reforms need to be put on the table, the human capital reforms, and lastly, instructional reforms. And I know our colleagues Connie and Estee will be addressing this a little bit later, but just again to set the table. In an industrial age economy, you have a traditional classroom setting where you have direct teacher instruction, a set number of students. But
In this model, we're really looking at what are the different ways that you can deliver instruction within the classroom. And one of the things that to be thrown out for conversation perhaps at the tables is, if you think about what happens in schools, there's kind of that mantra when you come in, put away your cell phone, put away your iPod, put away your iPad, that those don't really have a place in school and you can take them out when you go home. And yet, are we really missing out on something by not allowing that technology to really be infused in the classroom more, and for students to see it and to be able to use it in other ways? So we're kind of really taking those things that are there, but saying to the kids they have no place in school, which gives them a very mixed message about where technology sits.
right now, classes are taught by in-district staff only. But is there a possibility of having elected and specialized classes taught online? There is currently a pilot going on with 8 districts representing the 3 BOCES, Putnam Northern, Southern Westchester, and Rockland. And in those 8 districts, there is an effort to see how courses, at least elective courses, can be delivered online. It begins this September.
And I would add that this is an area where, poor New York State, but New York State is really lagging behind in this. If you look at a lot of other states, people think about Florida, Arizona, there are a lot of states that have really taken the whole technology piece and run with it. Some might say too much and too fast. But New York State really is first starting to grapple with some of the issues. Our regulations really don't deal with things having to do with using any kind of virtual learning or giving course credit for it. We need to really, the regents have been looking at some of those regulations, and some of the questions that come up are really important. Seat time was mentioned before. New York State is one of those states that seat time is what's really important when you're looking at graduation. Questions like what's a unit of study? What's a unit of credit? Is there a maximum number of online courses that a student should be able to take, or should it be more open? And then there are a lot of questions about instruction. How's instructions delivered? Does the teacher have to actually be in the room? Even if there's virtual learning, does somebody have to be in the room with the students? What does the student ratio have to look like? Is there a required level of interaction between the student and the instructor on a virtual course, or can it be somebody who's just delivering instruction but doesn't really have any kind of interaction with the students? And the other thing that's really important is who's qualified to teach. Right now in New York State, you have to be New York State certified. If you're looking at online learning, you might be dealing with an instructor who's not New York State certified but is delivering the course on a broader basis. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. The other thing is that we're really behind in a lot of our school districts on the infrastructure to be able to even support this kind of learning and this kind of technology in all of the buildings.
Currently, we enjoy local and state standards, and we test fundamentally for competencies and skills. But in a knowledge-based economy,
we're really looking at, again, this will be touched on much more, but we're looking at these core standards, looking at something that's much more collaborative among the states. New York State is part of a consortium. I'm probably going to get into a little bit more. It's called PARC, stands for Partnership for the Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers. And it's really looking at those things more globally. Again, it's just the standards. But there are some benefits to a state, like for all the states really, that are kind of very tight on dollars these days, because it's being done, if you do it as a consortium, there are some economies of scale and some reduced costs in putting those together, and of course to have the international benchmarks that were mentioned earlier.
a couple of examples, because you might say, this is wonderful theory, now where does it go? Well, I had the opportunity when I was superintendent of schools in Blindbrook to try a couple of models. Back in 2007, we surveyed 168 officials throughout the entire county, school board members, superintendents, business managers, etc. And we had a pretty good response rate, 35%. And here's what we found out when we asked questions about shared services. We asked them, are there areas that we could collaborate better on, more systematically, more comprehensively? And to use a familiar term, we found a good deal of what we called low-hanging fruit. That is to say, areas where at least 1/3 of those respondents thought this had a high incidence for success, success meaning saving dollars, and quite frankly, 70% rated at least high and medium. Now, if you take a look at these three concentric circles, cooperative purchasing from business office point of view. Now you say we are doing a good deal of that, but how comprehensive and systematic is it? How much do state laws limit us in that area? If you look at auditing, that doesn't sound like a terribly exciting prospect, but we spend a lot of money auditing our school district budgets. I know in Blindbrook, $60,000 for all the auditing. And we estimated we could save 50% of that if we were able to share services among several districts of varying size. Another very big one, intermunicipal district, BOCES, town, and village cooperation. The lowest hanging fruit there was student transportation. How much does it cost to transport students, particularly outside a school district? What about students going to special ed placements, private school placements, etc.? We found there's an enormous amount of money. I was busing children to certain placements in Westchester. My neighbors, Rhinebeck, Rice City, were doing the same. If we had one bus collaborating, could we have saved money? We did some studies on that, and quite frankly, a good deal of money was to be saved. Right now in Nassau County, they are working with a firm out of Albany, and they are able to look at about $400,000 in savings just in student transportation for this coming September by coordinating bus routes and bus services. I point to this as we begin to close out. Money is always on the table. where is the money being spent right now? Right now, according to the executive budget, New York State is spending $53 billion on education. That's a combination of state aid, combination of local property taxes, pull it all together. In New York State, if you look at the pie chart, 73%, the green, is being spent on classroom instruction programs, where it should be spent, because we are a labor-intensive business. Okay? We're working with human beings on a daily basis, and we need human beings talented and competent to work with those children. 9%, that red slice, are the leadership of your districts, your principals, your superintendents, your assistant principals, clerical support, OCs, areas like that. What we're proposing here is leave that alone for a moment. Don't take one pencil away from a child, one eraser away, one iPad away. Don't eliminate one assistant principal. How much money are you spending in that blue area, what we call capital expenses? It's close to $10 billion statewide. Now, what does that represent? Capital expenses. Let's take a look. All of your operation and maintenance, very important. Custodial, infrastructure work, contractual expenses, the elevators have to run up and down for handicapped children, etc. Transportation, we spoke about that earlier, within district, out of district, okay? Buses, fuel, etc. Building projects, both repair areas as well as infrastructure, as well as short-term and long-term. And equipment purchases and repair. 9.8 billion. All of this is necessary. But the argument is, in shared services, can we put the best minds together, doing it comprehensively, systematically, and save some money? If we did, just 10%, we could be close to $1 billion in savings in this state, statewide. Westchester spends about $500 million on that same section. So if we put our best minds together and say, lowball it at 10%, you do the arithmetic. And if you want to get more ambitious, 15 and 20%, maybe that's too ambitious. But, and I use the word comprehensive, not episodic. Oh yes, we share services with that district. Oh, this town does that. That's nice. Why can't all the towns do that? Why can't all the districts share in that? One last thought before we end. Another pilot we did in Blindbrook was the concept of differential staffing. Now, when I was hired, the school board said, Ron, we have too many teaching assistants. We have 30 of them. What are you going to do to get rid of them so that we can save some money? They're costing us salary and health benefits. I said, well, I just can't willy-nilly get rid of them. I have to study what we're doing. And one of the board members suggested, well, let's wait for them to retire and not replace them. Well, I said, that could be effective as a 30-year plan. I said, but if you really want me to address this, then I'll address it for you, but let me study the situation. And what we used was the concept of differential staffing. And let's get out of education for one brief moment. Walk into a hospital setting. Generally, an MD, a physician, has been the primary care deliverer. Right now, you have, within hospital settings, what I would call the beginnings, and to some degree success, of differential staffing. You still have MDs, but fewer of them. You have nurse practitioners paid less, but still achieving health outcomes. And you can do the study from there. What we're suggesting is, let's take a harder look at a better way of using teachers, teaching assistants, and teacher aides, and perhaps differential staffing them out so that we can begin to reduce some of the costs. I know at Blindbrook we reduced our teaching assistants from 30 to 10. We hired part-time employees. We increased productivity by having more hours. We paid those employees $25 per hour. But in a sense, I became Scrooge because several of those people lost health insurance. And so I plead guilty to that one. But the point is, in the process, what are we prepared to do in order to bring down costs over an extended period of time? Now, I'm not saying any one model is the best, but I think we need to start thinking in terms of limited resources. How do we keep the money on the table for the children? And what can we begin to do in terms of capital expenditures and other areas where we're going to have to bite some very hard bullets?
And I think to that end, it really comes to looking at a paradigm shift in the way that we deal with education and education finances today. As we said earlier, we can't just keep chipping away at the same things that we've always done. We really need to look at it with a very different lens, a different kind of model. And quite frankly, we need support from Albany and from Washington to be able to really do that. Because there are so many things that we can't do at the local level based on the current regulations.
So we're going to end at that point 5 minutes early. And Walter, would you like them to have some questions of us?
Thank you very much, Lisa and Ron, for I think that the governor and the state education department should really get a handle on this PowerPoint. Dan and I were talking. I want to mention that all of the PowerPoints are on the college website. You know, we wanted to go green, as green as we can. And as a result, every one of these PowerPoints, Dan's, Lisa, Ron, and then the subsequent PowerPoints, they're on the website. You can access them at your leisure, so I just wanted to mention that. Are there questions, as Ron and Lisa went over the whole issue of consolidation and the change from the industrialized society to a knowledge-based society? Are there questions on your mind as a taxpayer or as an educator? Judy.
That was great. Thank you very much. I'm going to put my school board member hat on for a second. Okay. And I think Ron, shared services is a great start. But is anybody talking about unfunded mandates and re-examining some of those? Because I can remember, as a school board member, it's easy to identify the low-hanging fruit. But there are limited opportunities there when you look at the overall budget, when unfunded mandates just occupy so much of the resources.
Very good point. Lisa, maybe you wanted to address that as a board member yourself.
I think that is clearly the big frustration, and that was one of the big frustrations with the Cuomo study, which really, at this point, is not going to make any changes. Clearly, that are going to impact planning for the 2011-12 budgets. But there are some really large items, and one of the ones that I would bring out, which sometimes is politically incorrect is the wrong word, but committee target, would be special education in New York State. New York State supersedes the federal regulations by pages and pages. We spend a lot more money than other states do to educate students, and yet, if you look at the statistics, and we know statistics can be twisted, but the statistics don't really show that we're getting better results. And there are a lot of nuances to the law that really lead to additional expenses for school districts. Some of them are legal ones that would not be necessary if the laws were changed, and yet we don't see movement on that. That's a very big ticket item, particularly in these hard times. Everyone wants to do the best that they can for children, but are there ways that we can change the regulations in the state in order to do that? So that's one that I would throw out that really comes out. We mentioned Triborough before, some of the pension, 3028 hearings, which were mentioned before. Changes to that would help with some expenses. There are so many different things. It's also interesting, the Regents just had something that they put out, that they were looking at some things. Anyone who's a middle school teacher, middle school, there's a lot of regulations around middle school that it could be run very differently if you didn't have to have these certain courses and do things in a certain sequence. There was some excitement that it was being looked at, and then we were told, or heard through the grapevine, that, well, we're just looking at it, but we're not necessarily really doing anything. So you really need that political will. And I think to the question that was asked before about what do people do, it really does take citizens and people in the community to really reach out and say to your legislators, we're taxpayers and we're voters. And we need you to make these changes because, as you know, as board members and superintendents and administrators, we've been talking about this for as long as I can remember, as long as I've been in this business, and people who've been in it longer have been talking about it for a lot longer. But you really need the people who are the citizens and most particularly voters to say, as a block, we need to see these changes go, or we're not voting you in. What are you going to do about these?
Thank you. Other questions that anyone has as it relates to consolidation or a change in terms of how we do business? I have one question, My first superintendency was a poor rural school district called Derrida. And we should have, it seemed to me, we had 770 students K-12. We should have consolidated with our neighbor, Fabius Pompey. Unfortunately, the community would not hear of it. I'm all for democracy, but I think given the fiscal crisis, it seems to me, and I'd be interested in your response, how do we get communities to consolidate in meaningful ways? Let's put the money aside. It seems to me in those communities, those kids were cheated from the education that other kids had in this state. It goes to the heart of what Dan was saying before. There was no way in Derrida we could provide the same opportunities that we provided in Skaneateles, which was my subsequent superintendency. So the whole issue of consolidation, how do you get communities to buy into it and to move forward for the best interest of their kids?
Walter is making an excellent point. I do work with new superintendents throughout the region, and I mean the entire state, in terms of school finance. And more northern districts are saying we must consolidate. The cost of transportation, we can't run the elective program at the high school that we want to run. They are being driven to it, and their communities are being driven to it by this lack of funding. Now, it's a horrible way to get there. But the point is, it's happening upstate. There are superintendents actively calling for the consolidation of districts. Downstate, it's not seen as much of a problem because take a Pocantico Hills, they're on a fantastic taxpayer base. It's called the Rockefeller Estate. So they're not being starved for funds. So at some point, it strikes me that the legislature is going to have to provide incentives for districts to begin to consolidate and look at those savings that can come from them. But it's going to have to take some mobilization at our level.
Okay, thank you. There'll be more conversation on this topic later on. Yes, Charles.
Adjunct, allow me a second question.
Charles, an adjunct here at the college.
I think Dr. Blood, the governor has actually looked at your PowerPoint because he's cut back $1.5 billion, and $1.5 billion is what you said was a 15% reduction in costs or efficiencies in operations in that area. So I just thought I'd make that observation.
It's the 10%. Unfortunately, I think he looked at some other things that may be more ethereal or less substantial. But in any event, I'm sure he would agree with this. One of our doctoral interns, and you're going to hear from a few of them tonight, is doing some advanced research in this area involving the county as well. Over 400 municipal officials. Luis I. DeLuca has already gotten a 35% response rate and is working very closely with Westchester County as well. County executive is very interested in this. So you'll be hearing more data on this area.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. One of the things we'd like to do as we transition, and there's one more question, okay. Yes.
I'd like to just ask a question. I understand, what you're saying about finance and the need to consolidate, but it seems that what always happens, what's been happening in New York State in particular, is that, for example, we were told when the lottery came in, that education was going to get lottery money. And then what happens is that the state reduces the amount of money that it gives to education. And then hearing that the federal government basically did the same thing, that they said take this money within the state, reduce. So we can talk about how to cut back and how to save, but are there also discussions, or is there any kind of lobbying or advocacy to get a commitment from the state to say, we're not going, you can save, but we're not going to reduce the amount we give you, because then we still seem to be in the same situation of the state or some entity cuts back on the amount of money that they give to the local, when this money that we save is saved to provide programs. So it seems to me that I don't hear that there is also that discussion of where do we stop this taking away once money has been saved or given, and rather than putting, leaving what's there and letting that be additional money.
If only there were a clean answer, it would be quite nice, but I think that there really isn't. And an example I would use is the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. and that lawsuit went through. There was a judgment saying that New York State was not properly funding education, had to fund it at a higher level. We got it for a couple of years, and then when the economy changed, suddenly what they've done is they've extended out the years and said, well, we're not going to give you the money, it's extended out. So I think I would go back to the only way to really put pressure is as taxpayers, because education, for all the lip service that it gets for being really important to every governor and to every legislator, the funding is just not there, and there seems to be a sense that the local taxpayer is going to take on the burden of covering whatever's needed in order to educate their children in the local school districts. It's really unfortunate. And particularly, as you'll hear from the next two presentations, we're talking about some new initiatives which have some really exciting parts, but take a lot of money. And so in this time when we're seeing less money come in, we have initiatives that have to cost money, and a good amount of money, in order to do them properly. So it's a real conundrum. Do you have a better answer?
No. I could never top Lisa. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you very much. What we would like is, I know you've been sitting for a while, you might want to stretch in place, and then they tell me that Michelle Obama would not like this. But there is some great desserts, I guess, coming around 6:30, not now, but 6:30, and feel free to come walking back and so on, and we'll transition. Also, you may want to talk to members at your table. There are two questions that Ron and Lisa have addressed here that you might want to discuss at your table, okay, when you come back. Okay, we'll transition to the next one.
The presentations, in my head I was listening to the Mexican song that says, ay, 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 canta y no llore. Sing and don't cry. This is the incredible conflict that we're dealing with, the reality of finances. But I'm going to say this. Regardless of finances and teacher effectiveness, there are boys and girls that are coming to schools that need to be taught. And they need to be given the best learning experiences, always. And I think for us is looking at this issue of the Common Core standards. And while there is great debate, Dan expressed that earlier today about the standards and how we view what should be common and what should not be common. There are concerns about how do we look at what's important nationwide and how will that be delivered, and how will we prepare our teachers so that our students can face a new era in teaching and learning and in living in our society. So today we're going to do two things. My colleague, Dr. Iervolino, and I are going to briefly give you a broad stroke, but the issue of the common standards needs significant amount of time and money to go into the details and understand what they really mean if we're going to create an environment where our children can meet the 21st century skills and challenges. So we decided to look at the issue from a very positive point of view because it's here. The Common Core Standards is in New York. They took the money, and I think they almost cashed it in. So no more about the check is in the mail. They cashed it in. So there is this urgency for us to look at what is it that's going to happen in these classrooms. And for those of you who are going to be teachers, we fight for support for you in that process. For those of us in higher ed, we are working very hard to understand this new paradigm thinking. And also, we are looking at all of our districts that have done excellent work and are making the comparisons to say, we can do this, we've done this, maybe we can do something a little bit different, maybe a little bit better. And for those where there are challenges, then we really have to roll up our sleeves. So we're going to talk about the idea of unpacking the Common Core standards. The New York State Education Department, the federal government, has put these on the websites in the hopes that we will all download this and commit it to memory. That will never happen. We will need to have these opportunities to really unpack and understand the thinking that went behind the way they've interpreted these standards. The focus of the Common Core standards is on higher order thinking and innovation for career and college readiness. And you'll hear that again and again. But I want to remind us that when we had the ELA standards here in New York in 1990, and we were all listening, speaking, reading, writing for information and understanding, and looking at critical analysis of literature and so on, we sort of understood that we needed to look deeper into our work with our students. In 2008 began a new initiative, and I hope I have the year correct, Walter, where through the leadership of Dr. Walter Sullivan and the regents, they said it's time for us to revisit the ELA standards and engage in bringing it to a level of meeting these 21st century skills. And then all of a sudden, I think it was 2009, we were told to stop dead in our tracks. And we have one of our colleagues here, Dr. Kate Hathaway, who was one of the writers of those initial standards, and many other hundreds of educators that put their minds together to have a vision and think about what these children would be like and what the teaching and learning experience would be like. Well, we were told to stop. And we were told that we would be adopting Common Core standards. So what's happened in 2010 is the analysis of new Common Core standards for ELA, English Language Arts, and mathematics. And as a result, this is how it has been defined for us. Whoops, too many buttons. That it's aligned with college and work expectations. That there's focused, clear, that the standards are focused, clear, and consistent and coherent. They're telling us that the Common Core standards include rigorous content and application of knowledge through higher order skills. They're telling us that it builds upon strength and lessons of current state standards. And they're telling us that they're internationally benchmarked and evidence and research based. And some of this is true, and some of it is questioned. So constant analysis of what this document provides is critical as we think about what is going to happen within this classroom. The features of now the new New York State Common Core learning standards guide schools so they can build on their best practices. So what's happened is that we'll have these standards, they're very broad, and they're hoping that school districts will engage in developing curricula, because someone said standards are not curriculum. So curriculum needs to be developed, curriculum maps would need to be developed, but looking at best practices and build upon that. It includes global and cultural perspectives, and that really wasn't as strong as we had hoped. And New York State folks that read the new Common Core insisted that we should look at this global and cultural perspective in the curriculum, because New York State, unlike Finland, is very diverse. That it needed to include extended practice in reading and writing and more nonfiction. And the conflict is the idea of giving up fiction and literature and genres that are so near and dear to the human value to informational text. So the argument in New York State is, where's the balance, and can we create that balance? And then there's the explicit instruction of literacy in all content areas. And this is something that we knew was significant when we were doing our initial work with the standards, And we're glad to see that they're continuing to move on that. Now, every state, New York State specifically, but all of them who adopted who accepted the money, said that we'll take the Common Core and that we will apply 85% of what the federal government has indicated as the Common Core standards. And that to give you some sort of freedom to add or to look at the gaps that exist, we'll give you 15%. So the discussions did take place last summer. I had attended those meetings, and there was a strong push to ensure that New York State include more fiction material, to include more global and cultural diverse perspectives in the curriculum, and to add to preschool learning standards which did not exist. And that was very important because we know that when children are coming to our kindergarten classes ready, they have an advantage. And also, we know that the Common Core standards will be aligned to the NAEP. So the purpose of all of this, the discussion, was how do we as an institution ensure that we will promote 21st century learners. And so they defined that students who are college and career ready in reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language have certain qualities. And these are that they're self-reliant, that they can work independently, demonstrate their independence, that they're active and that they build strong content knowledge, that they're responsive and respond to varying demands of audience, task, purposes, and discipline, that they're critical thinkers, that they comprehend as well as critique, that they're inquisitive, and that they value evidence. How do you know that? That they're tech savvy and use technology and digital media strategically and capably. And to have this broader thinking, understanding other perspectives and cultures. The notion that a government can disappear in 18 days is amazing to me today. So understanding how the world is operating and having that global perspective is significant. And I think this is where this effort on developing these 21st century skills is critical. So when teachers, administrators, community members, parents start looking at what is it that my kid is going to learn? Well, you're going to see it in a specific structure that we were told by the Obama administration that that structure had to remain as it was. And we did have the privilege, Dr. Sullivan and myself and several others in that initial team, to meet with the representatives as they examined the work that we had done compared to the Common Core standards. And what they had done is create grade level bands for K to 8, grade bands for 9 and 10, and grade bands from 11 to 12. That there's a focus on results rather than the means, an integrated model of literacy across all content areas, research and media skills blended into the standards as a whole, and one of the components significant in our 15% was the idea of viewing and presenting. So, when I got my little iPad, I was amazed when I went to the Apple store and talked to those young people and how capable they were to analyze a problem. And I would be the one that if I couldn't understand something with the technology, I would say, let's call the manager. And these young people said, no, I'll figure it out. And they'll get into the computer and they'll start asking questions to colleagues they don't know, but through the system because of their level of inquisitiveness and ability to search. And I said, oh, I'm behind the times. Shared responsibility for students' literacy development. It is not only the reading teacher's responsibility, but it's everyone's responsibility, including parents, family, the media. I always had this vision that every time I watched TV, wouldn't it be great if I always saw the words at the bottom and not have it as an option? Because I think then that might be helpful. To have focus and coherence in instruction and assessment, that they match to inform how a teacher does what she does, for principals to look at data more effectively, and for children to know what their pathway is in the process. So here we illustrate the modalities. We have reading, writing, speaking, and listening is how they put them together, and language. So in the reading area in general, they're looking for complexity and the growth of comprehension. The text types in writing, responding, and reading, and research. I mean, we're talking about children to know how to blog appropriately, to use all these technologies in a way that's going to be meaningful for them beyond the social network, but for major problem solving, or maybe to change a government system. Speaking and learning, flexible communication and collaboration and language, which includes the conventions of English, effective use and vocabulary. And finally, this is just an illustration that you can't see, but the document that's provided for you to download and look at is that the feds, along with the state, are looking at this progression. So teachers can see these standards and a progression, and from that, asking school districts to think about how they're going to unpack that. And I think that when we think about the qualities of that student with those 21st century skills is, do we find the type of cognitive rigor required in those standards? And if they're not there, fill the gap. And I come from a position that it's no more excuses about that 5%, the most needy, the poor. They are entitled to a rigorous, exciting, dynamic, engaging learning experience. And I think that maybe, like you said, timing, maybe this is a way to start thinking a little bit different about all children and not just some. And we have many gifted districts here in Westchester County that sometimes just doing the visits and having the conversation, that we can learn from each other and build on curriculum that's meaningful. And that when one student goes from one district to Scarsdale to Elmsford for another, that maybe there's some common sense about what is the expectations should be regarding standards. And I think that may be the goal. But there's a lot of gray area in this, and therefore for you as educators, for us in higher ed, for the community to really dig deep into these standards is going to be significant. And I think my colleague, Connie, will give you some very good suggestions of ways to approach this. So I hand over the mic.
Thank you, Estee. To pragmatics. It's been wonderful to see practitioners from the field, so many practitioners here. Pragmatics, how do we get it done? I see people from White Plains, administrators that I've known, and when I was principal in Rhinebeck, not only teachers, but also a student who is now a teacher. What a wonderful thing to see that. And so I think this is terrific. And pragmatics. This is a connection of theory and practice, because that's what practitioners need to do. We need to learn from the theory, but we need to apply it. And so that's what I hope to do here. How do we get it done? Well, we know a lot about successful schools. The last 25 years we have learned an enormous amount about effective schools. Way back 25 years ago, with the work of Ron Edmonds and the effective school movement and the first wave of research, for example, we know that effective leadership is absolutely essential. And what is effective leadership? Not charismatic leadership. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a leader who really can put the emphasis on the work that needs to be done, on teaching and learning. Because that's the business of schools, isn't it? Teaching and learning. We're not retail, we're not Apple, we're teaching and learning. And the second thing that is extremely important that we need to remember in effective leadership is that the principal needs to be affiliative, needs to be able to build collaborative teams, because nothing gets done, nothing within a school that gets done that's truly effective unless you have collaborative teams together. You build a collegial school. We're not talking about congenial, we're talking about collegial, where teachers work together. I was so informed in late 80s, beginning 90s, and really took off with this. My dissertation is on this topic regarding the work of Judith Warren Little and Susan Rosenholz regarding the fact that collaborative teams of teachers in schools have an effect on student achievement, a very positive effect. Later, out of Harvard, Newman and Whalage said the same thing. So the effective leader builds the team, the collegial faculty, and then they do the work together as a collegial faculty. So we look at effective instruction. We know, those of us who have spent our life in schools, that all instruction is not equal. We have many effective teachers, and unfortunately, we have many who are not. So that needs to be addressed. And we can't say that it's all the same. We absolutely know that there are powerhouse strategies, instructional strategies out there. Research tells us that there are 9 in particular that are extremely important. Teaching annotation, note-taking, comparison and contrast, and summarizing. So, did I just lose the mic? Yes. Okay. If you don't hear me in the back, please raise your hand. Okay. So we need to make sure that we use and we share this as collegial faculties as we work in teams, in departments, and on grade levels. So important, the next piece, the idea of a guaranteed and viable curriculum. What does that mean? Faculty, teachers working together build a uniform curriculum maps across the grade, across the departments. Because every student needs the opportunity to learn, OTL, equity and excellence. If you do not have curriculum maps, K through 12, you cannot guarantee that every student will, from grade to grade, get what they need. You will not be able to guarantee that there are not gaps in the curriculum. And I ask this question in every new class I have. Raise your hand if you have curriculum maps in every subject area in your school. And it is astounding how few have that consistently, and that is so important. So that can be built, and that starts from the top, working with the talented teachers on the grades and in the departments. And it needs to be viable. Why viable? Viable because we need to determine that there's time to do it. So we have to take the curriculum and look at the content and say, what can I teach? What can we teach in this amount of time? We also have to watch for the time wasters in our school, the PA systems. I'm still astounded when I go into schools to have PA systems interrupting instruction. Incredible. The worst I heard was yesterday, a teacher said actually that the office called up and said, who ordered Chinese food for lunch? I kid you not. I mean, it's shocking. So these things are easy. This is an easy thing. Let's do a time audit. In ineffective schools, only 29% of the day is used for instructional time. In effective schools, it's 69%. There's still a lot of time there. So that's something that we can address. So again, with the collaborative faculty, the collegial teams, we're working to look at focused, sound lessons, instruction. We know what a model lesson should be. We know we need to have a clear, explicit aim. We know we need to have modeling. Direct instruction is still important. And we need to check for understanding. Formative assessment is essential. You can't just wait to the end of a lesson or a test to find out if kids are getting it. Good teachers know this. Good teachers are doing this. all teachers on the team need to learn what good teachers do, because there are tons of them out there to do that. So the research, I said that we're mixing theory and practice, and that's so important. The research has informed some part of the new standards, and they talk about emphasis on building a base of content knowledge. That is here, and vocabulary. That we need to have content-rich curriculum, extensive reading and writing in the content areas. Why? We're not trying to abolish novels, certainly, and biographies and poetry, but what, for example, cognitive scientists say, like Daniel Willingham, and by the way, we have a bibliography at the end of references, so if you might want to access at another time, you certainly can do that. So Daniel Willingham speaks about the fact that it is key to acquire the basic knowledge and mastery skills to have considerable background knowledge. That prior knowledge, we know, helps students' comprehension, make sense, common sense, the schema, and that's built by building the background knowledge. The vocabulary, the academic vocabulary, which I mentioned here, that there is an academic vocabulary, and if we do reading and writing through the content areas, then there will be a commonality for some of the things that we're going to emphasize. Now, I've had science teachers in high school say, look, I didn't sign up to be a reading teacher. If I wanted to be a reading teacher, I would have gone for reading. But the point is, if you want your students to be successful in science, or global history, or any of the others, they need to be able to do, know, and apply the language of the subject, the academic vocabulary. So we need to keep building that. The extensive reading and writing that we spoke about. I read a recent Scholastic survey, perhaps you did as well, that said they asked kids how much reading they did, and they asked them what was considered reading and writing. And they said texting and surfing the web. And only 51% said in books. Now, that's a good thing and it's a bad thing, because I see some writing, sustained writing, that looks like texting back and forth, that doesn't have the conventions that we know that educated prose and expository writing needs to be. So we have to find the balance here. Extensive reading and writing in the content area. The Matthew effect, perhaps you've heard of it. But way back in '86, Keith Stanovich, who wrote broadly on the topic, spoke about and wrote about how readers get to be better readers. No surprise, right? Those who can read get better. The rich get richer. There is a cumulative effect of reading. So if you take a middle school student, for example, who is a poor reader, they read about, if they're lucky, 100,000 words a year. If you take an average reader in middle school who does average reading, it's 1 million words a year, 10 times more, right? A proficient reader in middle school reads 10 to 50 million words a year. And part of it is practice makes proficient. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. So the more we can get kids to read, the more we have to let them know that reading, that you will get better. Like playing baseball, playing the violin, playing the piano. You get better by doing it, by reading. So looking at what school leaders and teachers need to know. We said that, Dan said it, Estee said it, standards are not curriculum. So what we need to do is identify, teachers together need to identify what the content is going to be, how it's going to be taught, the instructional strategies, what it's going to be. Faculties need to map that curriculum, K through 12, figuring out what's going to have time to be taught and taught deeply rather than just superficially. That they'll plan together and design assessments, lessons, and assessments. That standards need to be integrated. Everything needs to be integrated. Connections are so important. We don't learn. The standards as they look fragmented. But effective instruction is not fragmented. It's cohesive. There's a meaning to it. We need to connect that. We need to design those lessons in faculty teams. One of my favorite remembrances of being in Japan was going into teachers' rooms, and they had desks all together where they all planned lessons together, back to back, and they planned lessons together. If we do reading through the content areas, students will develop those mutually skills that will be addressed by many content areas. So we can develop a rich task, such as doing research, developing a discussion group to get ready for persuasive writing, or argumentative writing, or for debating, and that can embrace many of the standards if we look at it carefully. We're not supposed to teach them in fragmented silos. That was not the way, that was not the goal, though that every standard document looks like that. We said it before, sustained reading and writing needs to increase dramatically. The educational leadership from last month speaks, professor from Emory University speaks about the fact that 45% of the kids, even with fairly high ACT scores and SAT scores, do not have the skill to really tackle complex text and write lengthy papers. Connections, faculty collaboration is absolutely essential. You have the faculty there. You have, I always feel that good principals are treasure discoverers. They have to know who's terrific in their school for what, so that they can link people together who know what they're doing and who can help teams. We've even had a particularly strong team do a fishbowl for other teams to show how do teams work. These teachers are in your schools already, some very gifted faculty that need to be used in a very, very strong way that way. And so they'll develop the maps so that there's opportunity to learn. And develop the essential questions and big ideas that you know can guide the content and the process, and then the assessments. And we know that assessment, we need to be designed together, common assessments at the end. If you don't have common assessments, if you have curriculum maps and you have aligned curriculum that's guaranteed, common assessments will move the school tremendously. And we know that the new paradigm of assessment, we've talked about the paradigms, the new paradigm of assessment says that we're not only seeing that what kids have learned, but also I'm using it to inform my instruction. So it's focus and depth. Focus, depth, and connection. Focus on integration of the strands of the standards into cohesive units and lessons, and working together, teachers designing. An example is given there. Make sure that we're focusing on content rich. We need that background knowledge. Kids need to build on it. Again, in collaboration. Less is more. Identify the content we truly can teach. Focus on depth. Remember the Matthew effect. Remember Keith Stanovich and the fact that practice makes proficient. And let kids know that with a well-designed lesson, expert instruction, and their effort, they can succeed. Because of the new paradigm also of crystallized intelligence and the theory that we grow our intelligence. The more we learn, the more we read, the more we grow our intelligence. It's not fixed, as that was thought. And that's out of the University of Pittsburgh, the work of Principles of Learning and Lauren Resnick. Keep focusing on what works. I think it's so important that the latest book that Mike Schmoker wrote, which is speaking on focusing on the essentials, and it's a 2011 copyright, the citation is on the references, speaks to that even with textbooks, as textbooks get more difficult, we need to help kids read them. In other words, we need to model how I annotate a textbook, how I underline, how I make sense of it, how I take notes, and how I summarize as it gets more and more difficult. We don't do it once. Once is clearly not enough. Many, many times. And to remember that summary writing, note-taking, they're some of the most powerful of the instructional strategies. Professional development is the only thing I'm going to say because I realize I have time. We spoke about collaboration, we spoke about focus, absolutely, in transforming the standards and the assessments. Professional development, the best professional development that has been shown, and I'm living testimony in the school that I was principal and also in White Plains, in Rhinebeck and White Plains, came from teachers to teachers. You can do turnkey, teachers learn better from teachers than from, and believe me, I've been a consultant a lot. I had the best experienced consultant because they're there every day, and the new professional development paradigm is embedded, it's authentic. It's teachers working together to see what a kids need, analyzing the students' work. The collaborative analysis of student learning is a huge professional development opportunity. And that's something that should be explored and used. And so hopefully to summarize that, focus on what works. Successful schools prioritize teaching and learning. That's the business of schools. Continuous improvement. Improvement is not a bad word. I feel that oftentimes the sense is that if we have a school that needs improvement, we all should be on an improvement movement. We all should be looking to best our best. Jim Collins wrote a book, Good to Great. If you think you're good enough, you're going to start slipping. We've seen it in many, many places. We've seen it in companies. We've seen it in schools. Essential to think of that. Explicit instruction with extensive opportunity for practice. And I feel I'm a born optimist. We have all seen wonderful schools. Can they be better? Absolutely. No matter what comes down, it is the teacher in the classroom and it is the child who needs to be taught. And the quote that we have to remember, I think, one of the quotes perhaps, is that isolation is the enemy of improvement in schools. That's Mike Schmoker's too. I wish I invented it. That you need to connect talented people and you need to give them the opportunity to work together. And it makes for more productive teachers, more effective teachers, and more effective schools. And I believe that this is the way we will get the work done.